watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
Hello, I'm Mark Golub. And again, one of the things we enjoy doing most is introducing you to the extraordinary people, men and women, who are helping to shape Jewish life today. And I was thinking about how there are so many different ways in which ordinary Jews help create a sense of vibrancy in Jewish life today. Jewish teachers, rabbis, social workers, educators, people who are in the state of Israel helping to upbuild the modern Jewish state, all those in the Tzahal, all those who serve in the civilian Israeli army. There are so many ways in which people contribute to Jewish life today. The individual I have the privilege of sitting with now is one who has, on his own, made contributions to Jewish life that will last for decades and decades and for generations. He's an individual who made a great deal of money in the stock market and then moved his passion from the stock market to what he calls his people, the Jewish people. And he has now spent, I don't know, the last 10, 15 years trying to create a renaissance of Jewish life, as he writes in his extraordinary biography, No Bull, his life in and out of the stock market, a remarkable book. If you haven't ever read No Bull, you should pick it up. It is not only a brilliant book, it is a very touching book, a courageous book in many ways. Anyway, this individual has lent his substance and his mind to creating institutions of Jewish life, institution after institution, that is now serving the Jewish community intellectually and spiritually and in terms of the Jewish soul in ways that I believe no other human being is doing on this earth today. It is an enormous privilege to introduce you to Michael Steinhardt, who I have the pleasure of sitting with once again. And Michael, I can't thank you enough for inviting us into your office and being willing to share some of your insight with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
You know, Michael, there's that wonderful line from Fiddler on the Roof, attributed to the show, the Zero Mastal, actually comes from Shalom Aleichem. And often I say to myself, there are many bromides in the Jewish community, many slogans. You know, we hear the line from Woody Allen in Annie Hall, the Jew never buys retail. The line that has to do with money comes from Fiddler on the Roof, which is, when you're rich, they think you really know. And for so many people, it's true. They think you know. When it comes to you, it is not only your money, but the extent to which you have committed yourself to understanding Jewish life. You're an observer of the Jewish scene. When people come to you, they not only get somebody who has the wherewithal at times to make things happen, but what I'm interested in right now, Michael, is the extent to which you observe, understand, and have a passion for what happens to the Jewish future and what you see at the moment for the Jewish people as we, conclude one decade and begin the next decade here in the 21st century. So I'd love to talk a little bit about your philosophy of the Jewish community, and maybe if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about yourself as well. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. I mentioned your book already, No Bull, which I love. It's a wonderful read. You wrote in 2001. You had left the stock market. You already immersed yourself in Jewish philanthropy and tzedakah and Jewish causes, and you had just created, not everybody may know your name, but everybody knows Birthright Israel, which was this genius creation of yours, and you did it with Charles Bronfman. But the book really goes up to that moment when you were there with your wife Judy, and the first plane arrives with some 5,000 of the 6,000 people who were part of Birthright Israel in the very first year, and culminates in a very, very moving speech you give to this group, and you describe also how it touched you as well. But one of the things you write about in No Bull is how you believe that your philanthropy, what you want to do, is not look backwards. I don't know if you remember writing this. You said that very often people involved in Jewish philanthropy look backwards. It's very Holocaust-driven, and that you want to look forward. And you created the Jewish Life Network, one of the first major things you created to touch Jews in many, many ways. I want you to begin by talking for a moment about what it means to you to look forward as opposed to what you feel many other people do in Jewish life today, looking backwards.
That's a good question, because it to some degree does capture an element toward the understanding of my approach in relation to what I think is the overwhelming state of the Jewish world, which I find rather sad. As I listened to your introduction, it was, in some sense, an optimistic introduction about all these wonderful people who do wonderful things in the Jewish world, and the suggestion was that it's a good Jewish world. My view is it's not such a good Jewish world, particularly in the diaspora, and particularly in the non-Orthodox diaspora, which is where I focus. So I think I would not have been attracted to the Jewish world in 1995, which is about 15 years ago, if I had felt then that it was a healthy, vigorous, forward-looking Jewish world. But I felt, in contrast, that it was a moribund Jewish world, which was continuously losing its young people, which was whose tzedakah had dramatically changed to the point where only a small fraction of the total philanthropy of Jews was going to Jewish causes, where interest in Israel was declining, where the number of American Jews going to Israel was not growing, where the culmination of Jewish life seemed to be, for a young person, the bar mitzvah, and from that point on it was downhill. So there were many, many, many reasons to be negative about it, where the pinnacle of focus was indeed the past. If it wasn't the Holocaust, it was anti-Semitism, and there were a number of organizations focused on anti-Semitism in America, and anti-Semitism has always been far more mythical than real in America. And it is more mythical than real in America. It's as if organizations have to create the bogeyman of anti-Semitism in order to raise money. And while the Holocaust, we know, was an event of extraordinary enormity, the fact that it dominates our lives to the degree it does today somehow detracts from our ability to think about the Jewish future. And that in and of itself is sad, because it's hard to be focused intensively on the Holocaust and at the same time to think about what we want to accomplish and what we want to be in the 21st century. So I am anything but enthusiastic about the non-Orthodox diaspora. I am anything but pleased about American Jewish education, particularly in its non-Orthodox.
You are not pleased.
I am not pleased. I think that many of the trends that we have seen, such as the fact that 55 or 60% of non-Orthodox Jews marry out, such as the fact that only 15% of our total philanthropy of Jews goes to Jewish causes, and many, many other measures are reflective of the fact that non-Orthodox Jewish education in America has and continues to be a shanda, an abysmal failure.
By the way, Michael, clarify for our audience. Do you consider yourself an Orthodox Jew?
I am an atheist. Let it be clear. I am an atheist. I started in life coming from a family that was nominally Orthodox. By nominally Orthodox, I mean we came from a Orthodox tradition, but we're sort of on the way out. Not unusual in the 1940s in lower middle class Bensonhurst. But I went to an Orthodox synagogue. I was bar mitzvahed in an Orthodox synagogue. But by the time I was reaching my soon-to-be teen years, we were bringing Chinese food into the house, blah, blah, blah. That typical sort of relatively poorly educated family who nevertheless, wondered why people wore sneakers on the Jewish holidays and
Of Yom Kippur.
on Yom Kippur, and didn't turn lights on, and sort of marveled at these peculiar, inexplicable.
And no one ever gave you answers to these questions.
And they were not good answers anyway, but that's the tradition in which I came. But soon after I got into my mid-teens, I asked tougher questions, having seen in Brooklyn in my youth older people who had tattoos on their arms, and knowing what that meant, you couldn't but help to ask the question, how could there be a God that was omniscient and omnipresent and all those omna?
And good.
And good, thank you. And at the same time have allowed his chosen people
evil, yes,
to have experienced that. And it was a challenging question.
Okay.
And the easiest answer to that question was that he did not exist, does not exist. So for most of my young life, I was an atheist, but a guilt-ridden atheist. And it was important to emphasize that point. So when I came back from college, on Yom Kippur, I would consciously eat in front of my fasting family to show how serious I was and how much it meant to me.
In the rejection of God.
In the rejection of God. And then, still feeling guilty and trying to regain faith, I began to collect Judaica. And if you look a little bit around this room, and if you look in the rest of this office, you'll see one of the world's largest collections of Judaica, which was my effort through osmosis, or something to bring the precious objects of our people over the last 3 or 4 or 5 centuries close to me, thinking that might bring me closer to faith.
Did it?
No. And as I've grown older, I have not been able to regain faith. And indeed, I no longer feel guilty. So now I'm just a plain old, unrecalcitrant atheist.
Wonderful. Now you answered my question. I wanted to make sure the audience understood, are you Orthodox, with the answer of, I'm atheist. You and I spent one lovely evening together in which we sort of battled and discussed the whole notion, the rabbinic notion of God. And I was saying to you that I believe the God you rejected is a God that the rabbinic Jewish tradition never, ever accepted. We'll put that aside. Maybe we'll get to that, because I love talking theology with you. But my point was, whether you're an atheist or not, the question is, which community do you identify with culturally? And, you wrote within, again, No Bull, this extraordinary statement of your own, where you place yourself Jewishly. I want to read this to you, and then I want to come back to the same question. And it comes out of your comment that you're so disappointed with non-orthodoxy in the diaspora. But I want to read this from your book. This is page 29 of No Bull, which will give you a sense of exactly where Michael Steinhardt's orientation is when it comes to his own sense of Jewishness. This is what you wrote. I have made a higher form of commitment that does not require a supernatural being who rewards and punishes, and from whom values emerge. From whom we'll talk about that too, by the way. You have a fascinating interchange about what Jewish values are in your book. Instead, you write, I am one who cherishes Jewish history and takes pride in this people that have endured with or without God's help. The heroism is all human. The suffering is all human. And while belief has played an important role over the centuries, it is the human achievement, not the belief, that I revere. Thus, the Jewish attribute I cherish most highly is my sense of peoplehood. My love for Jews transcends logic itself. What a wonderful line. My love for Jews transcends logic itself. I love being helpful to all kinds of Jews, not because I find them to be blessed or superior to other people, but because I feel a distinct emotional attachment to them. This love I feel may be akin to faith itself. I feel deeply Jewish, although paradoxically, I cannot accept the Jewish theological tradition. You remember writing that?
God, it sounds so good. Did I really write that?
You wrote that. It is a gorgeous page. Page 29 of No Bull, a marvelous special book. Anyway, I feel you articulate in those two paragraphs the essence of what being a Jew is. And we do a show on Shalom TV, Jewish 101, where I try to explain what the rabbinic tradition really says about God and the Jewish people, and how the mindset of the Jew is so unusual, how Jewish values do in fact exist. In your book, you talk about a conversation you had with a rabbi who argued that Jewish values was really, there was no such thing as Jewish values. You remember that mentioned in your book? Anyway, I believe that what you write here is the essence of what a Jew ought to be, what the rabbis want a Jew to be. And when it comes to God, each of us struggles within ourselves to find that God, not find that God. It's a lifelong journey. The question is, what do we do in the meantime? What you have chosen to do, Michael, is cherish the Jewish people and to love Jews, not because they're blessed or superior, but because they're your people. And so when I said to you, do you consider yourself Orthodox? I wasn't asking you a theological question. I was asking, when you imagine yourself within the Jewish community, is there any movement of Judaism you feel comfortable with? Or better said, does Michael Steinhardt consider himself to be Orthodox or non-Orthodox? When you talk about your respect for, no, your disappointment with, and that's a mild word for you, you're much more than disappointed with non-Orthodox Jewish education and Jewish life. Do you feel you're part of that community? And that was the essence of where I wanted to go, because I want people to understand from where you come that you would make the statement, you're so disappointed with non-Orthodoxy, and yet you seem to have a great respect for Orthodox education. So speak to that.
Well, you capture it well. Let me start by saying several things. Number one, I believe there are only two types of Jews in the world. One is the traditional or Orthodox Jew, of which clearly I am not.
You are not.
I am not. I'm not. By no measure am I that. And the other type is what I call the secular Jew. secular is the word I use, and I include in the secular all those Jews who basically beat to the drummer of the Western world, to that which began, give or take, 300 years ago, the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. And whether we're conservative or reform or reconstructionist or atheist or ethical culture or whatever, we are all secular Jews. So from my perspective, there are only two types of Jews in this world. And to make other gradations is illusory. But that dichotomy is extraordinarily important.
Is one better than the other?
No.
Say
No.
that again. You're not making a value judgment.
No, sir.
You're making basically a sociological description.
Between the two types of Jews
A
that
Jew
exist.
committed to halakha to one degree or another, and a Jew less committed or not committed to halakha.
Right. A Jew not committed to halakha per se. Orthodox Jews are committed to halakha, period. Not pick and choose. I mean, secular Jews might be and are, of course, they're committed to some aspects of halakha. They're human beings. They're committed to broad human values, and some of those are appropriate in halakha. But broadly speaking, there's that dichotomy. Orthodox Jews are different. They go to different schools, eat different food, marry different people. When they can, they live in different neighborhoods. I mean, the differences are overwhelming. They even vote differently than secular Jews. They vote conservatively. Most Jews vote liberally. I mean, go on and on and on and on. There are enormous differences between Orthodox Jews and secular Jews.
And forgive me for pressing you again. You're not making a value judgment here.
No.
A little bit?
Well, the reason I hesitate is because while I am in no sense an Orthodox Jew, there are certain things about their community that I admire.
Would you like all Jews to be Orthodox Jews?
No.
Why not?
Because it's not realistic or possible to think that all Jews will have that belief system. Orthodox Jews have a certain belief system. They believe in kashrut. They believe in all sorts of things that are dependent upon halakha. So no, what I would like is for Jews to have the intensity of Jewish commitment that most Orthodox Jews have.
And which many non-Orthodox Jews don't have.
Well said.
Okay. And you as a non-Orthodox Jew, again, you describe in your book how your Jewish youth and how you were at B'nai Isaac and it drove you nuts, and then you have a lovely description of your bar mitzvah the last time you see your grandmother at your bar mitzvah, and then you describe your movement away. And now as an adult, you are certainly not an Orthodox Jew.
Right.
But there is a commitment that you have that is as passionate as the one you see in Orthodoxy. Michael, where does that come from in you?
I'm not smart enough to answer that question. I just don't know.
Is that really, do you have a feel, an instinct?
For a while, and maybe today, and I used to say this regularly, I say it a little less today, Israel, the contemporary political state of Israel, was the substitute for me for the religion. Israel was, and I guess perhaps still is, the Jewish miracle of our lifetime. And while the religion was so deeply disappointing, is so deeply disappointing, its practice, its verbiage, its inability to reflect upon realistically upon our lives, I could forgive almost anything vis-a-vis Israel. Israel was my Jewish miracle. And to some degree, with its many, many warts and the fact that it has turned off, sadly, much of the younger diaspora generation, it remains my miracle, although its politicians are writ large awful, its businessmen are of less than glorious quality. And when you walk down Dizengoff Street in Tel Aviv and you look around at these people and you say, this is who you admire? These are the people that you really think are, I sometimes say, it's easier to be a Zionist in Manhattan than it is in Tel Aviv, if you know what I mean.
You were 5 years old when David Ben-Gurion reads the Declaration of Independence of the modern state of Israel. You were only 5. Your entire life, Israel has been a reality. For people older than you and I are, there are people who lived the miracle because at one point in their life there was no Israel and then there became an Israel. So at what point, is it 67? Was there some event in your life that somehow flipped that switch for you and you recognized that the modern miracle of Jewish life is the creation of the Jewish state of Israel? When does Michael Steinhardt somehow...
Very, very early. I mean, somehow, for me, Mark, in the 50s, I used to read the newspapers every day about the drama of the Israeli getting or not getting the Mystere jets from France and the Mirage jets from France and the taking of the boats at the Cherbourg. And I remember it. I mean, I used to, for me, and I say this with a little bit of cynicism, I bought the act that Israel was perpetually on the verge of being thrown into the sea. They hooked me totally.
Why do you call it an act? You don't think there was no truth to it?
Don't you sit back in the year 2009 and say, hey, they were going to be thrown into the sea in 48, 49, 56, 67. I mean, they were always on the verge of extinction. It never happened.
Even now we're told.
And even now, Iran and you know, you wonder, so are we the subject of Zionist propaganda or is it true? You know, the answer is I don't know. But it's not unreasonable for an intelligent person to sit back with a sense of objectivity and say, I was really subject to the propaganda that I wanted to believe and cared so much about. Maybe. I mean, I was ready to get on a plane and almost did try to get on a plane in 1967. I mean, I would have happily sacrificed my life for Israel in 1967. I mean, I was committed in the fullest sense to that place. I still am.
You still are.
I still am.
Yes, I don't want our viewers to think that what you're saying is you're less committed now.
No, I still am. I bought a house there. I have a wonderful house in the middle of Jerusalem. I love Israel. I love Israel. I love America. And it's a complicated situation. I mean, my wife's mother, who's no longer with us, used to say, I'd always listen to her and I couldn't quite figure out exactly what she meant. She'd say, if I were to be born again, there's no one I'd rather be than an American Jewish housewife having lived my life in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And I said, oh, that's so great about being an American Jewish housewife, having lived my life in Scranton, Pennsylvania. But that's what she believed to the depth of her soul. And I too believe I really have been fortunate, having had the freedom to make my own choices, to have contributed as I've contributed, to have expressed myself, to have the freedom to be as nasty as I am to the Jewish establishment, deservedly so, and it's been a wonderful experience.
Okay, I love it. So now come back to the issue of Jewish education and the journey you were beginning to speak about, that you are so disappointed about the expression and experience of Judaism, of Jewishness in the non-Orthodox world.
Right.
Even though it's a world that you're committed to personally yourself.
Correct.
Even though it's a world you have spent your own money to try to build.
Correct.
In very many ways. Michael, what is it that drives you to want to make non-Orthodox diaspora Jewry more vibrant, survive, extend to the next generation?
It's not so much, Mark, that I want them to survive to the next generation. It's what I want them to be is to fit my image of the nobility, of the virtue, of the highest quality that is my image of Jewishness. That's what I want.
That's lovely, Mike.
That's what I want. And
say it again. You want the Jew today to somehow embody the nobility of all the Jew can be.
Right. And you know, it doesn't have to be a Jew who can make that, who can reach that quality. And that's one of the ironies. I wrote a speech recently which I gave, which you probably don't have, but you should get. I'm very proud of it because I put a great deal of effort into it. It was part of a series called State of World Jewry. It was given at the 92nd Street Y, and if any of your audience wishes to get it, they just can call my office. And my focus in that speech, and my focus recently, has been to emphasize Jewish values. But not Jewish values in the cliched, universalistic way they're usually spoken about. I don't go for phraseologies like tikkun olam and stuff like that, because it's just not true. It doesn't capture truth. And the reason, one of the reasons why American Jewish education fails is it doesn't capture truth for these kids, and therefore it doesn't resonate. And I used to kiddingly say that hundreds of thousands of kids, Jewish kids, have gone through the Hebrew school process. Hebrew school. I mean, can there be a worse word in the American Jewish lexicon than Hebrew school? And I used to say there were 6 kids in this entire 20th century who liked it. 3 of them were lost in the mountains of Wyoming, and 2 of them in South Africa. I mean, there's just no one. It's been a horrible experience. And what I've tried to do recently is to create, and if this sounds presumptuous, it's probably because it is presumptuous, a set of what I would call Jewish values that are applicable in the year 2009, that separate us from our Christian neighbors in the year 2009.
Give me an example.
I will. Because the point is, after a century or more of integration, assimilation, you know, why be Jewish? What's different from in us? And I ask people the question, if you were sitting at Harvard today and you picked out 25 Jews and 25 non-Jews and they were all in the same room, could you distinguish them today? Well, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, you could distinguish the Jews from the non-Jews. Can you today? If a Jew grows up in Sacramento, California, and he's 1% of the population in Sacramento, California, and he goes to a public school and goes to the local Sacramento Reform Temple for an hour or 2 a week for a couple of years and gets bar mitzvah, and that's his Jewish education. Well, what is he? He went to the same schools, played the same sports, watched the same television. What makes him Jewish? The answer is not much. And after he's finished with that glorious bar mitzvah, or bat mitzvah, he goes then to the California State university system. You know, it's very difficult to make the pitch that this person is genuinely different. So to ask the question, what Jewish values have we that distinguish us from our Christian neighbors, is a worthwhile question. And it's not one that those wonderful educators in the Reform and conservative movements have bothered to ask. And I'm angry at them. I'm angry at those people who have done such a poor job of undereducating our next generations. And it just, so I get a little bit, forgive me, fatutzt.
It's very important. No, it's important to hear this.
Yeah.
Give me one
so
example.
I'll give you a number of
and
examples.
We'll see if we agree.
One example that separates Jews from Jews in our theology is the following. We believe in a certain spirituality. They believe in a certain spirituality. We may believe in God, they believe in God. But our spirituality is an uncomfortable spirituality, is a spirituality that doesn't accept a God who's someone with a long white beard sitting up there and blessing everybody, or sitting up on a lovely cloud and saying sweet things. Ours is a spirituality of disagreement, of fighting, of being unhappy. Ours is a spirituality of Job. Ours is a spirituality of Israel, where we wrestled with God. And the word I like to use is, ours is a struggling spirituality. They don't have struggling spirituality. So that's the difference. Ours is a continuous struggle. Theirs is not. And that's part of being Jewish. So one of the values that a Jew has to recognize is, it's not a simple relationship with God. We have to understand what works for us, what doesn't work for us. Who was Job, and why Job is important to us? Who was Isaac, and what does Isaac mean? All that is struggling spirituality. That's one value.
So Michael Steinhardt, how interesting are you? You establish before anything else that you're an atheist.
Right.
And yet when I say to you, give me a Jewish value, and what I mean here is a Jewish value that somehow you feel is important, the first value you speak about is the quest, the wrestling, to use your word, such a Jewish word, concept, the wrestling with God. You know, it's, of all the things that one would not expect to come out of Michael Steinhardt's mouth to begin with, is that one of the things that for you characterizes this
Correct.
wondrous, unique Jewish value system is the way people struggle with God after you've told us that if there's one thing that's irrelevant to you, it's God. Explain this to me.
I didn't say it's irrelevant. God was very relevant to me for
There
much
is
of
no
my
God
life.
to you. There is no God.
I concluded that there is
for Michael
no
Steinhardt,
God.
there's no God.
But
yet for you, where you begin is that this is the way in which the Jew wrestles with the notion of God.
correct.
Is so inherently, almost at the core,
Correct.
certainly of the
Does
spirituality of the Jew.
does that seem inconsistent
Yes,
to you?
yes.
Well, maybe it is. I don't think it is. I think you would acknowledge, Mark, maybe you wouldn't, but there are many, many, many Jewish atheists. Sigmund Freud.
Most Jews are atheists. Well, boy, I said to you before, I'm going to say it again.
Yeah.
Most Jews, Michael, are agnostics.
Agnostics.
Most
Okay.
Jews, and Judaism, I believe, more than tolerates, it almost extols agnosticism because of the extent to which Jews are realistic and the rabbinic tradition is realistic.
Right.
To say that there's a God with absolute certainty in this world takes a leap of faith that almost defies reason. But to say there is for sure
No God?
no God is a chutzpah that goes beyond logic as well.
Number one, I accept what you just said. I choose to say I'm an atheist because I don't want to live my life saying maybe yes and maybe no. I would rather use, as I did throughout my life in business and in most other things, using the thrust of logic, using incomplete information,
Yes.
not all the facts.
Yes.
We don't get all the facts and most judgments we have to make. And based upon the facts I have chosen to believe there is no God. But that doesn't mean...
That you're not struggling with it too.
Absolutely.
You're amazing. Can I give you a Jewish word and tell me if this at all resonates with you?
Yeah.
There's one, it's a small Hebrew word. Many Jews don't know it. It's a rabbinic term, ke'ilu.
No.
Ke'ilu is a rabbinic term that means as if. The rabbis argue that every individual wrestles within his own soul yes God, no God, some God. You know, the phrase that God has hidden his face is the rabbinic expression of, I don't know that I still believe in God.
Right.
The Jew is asked, in the midst of whatever crisis of faith, wrestling with faith, search for faith, the real issue from the rabbi's perspective is, we don't care what you believe, we care how you behave. Act ki'ilu, you believe in God. Act as if you believe in God, even when you are a serious doubter. You understand, when I look at your life, you've done that instinctively. Even now, as you, I mean, it just comes out of you. You're a ki'ilu kind of guy. You will struggle and you will wrestle. You are not going to check your mind at the door. You will not allow intellect to be placed on hold. You will wrestle. In the meantime, Michael Steinhardt acts ki'ilu. There's a God. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I do. I do.
Does it resonate at all with you?
Yeah, no, it does. I understand. I understand.
All right, talk to me just for a couple moments about education as we near the end here. How do you feel about day school education?
I started something called PEAGE, and PEAGE is the dominant organization in the day school world. Partnership for Excellence in Jewish Education. I started 14 or 15 years ago, filled with optimism about day school education. And in the first 6 or 7 years, we encouraged and paid for the creation of new day schools. And there were some new day schools. But it became clear to me over time that in the non-Orthodox world, day schools were never going to be an important element in education. That in the non-Orthodox world, day school was never going to be an important element.
The Solomon Schechter experience is not going to do it for you.
Well, the Solomon Schechter experience is reflective of that. The Solomon Schechter schools are in decline. There are less Solomon Schechter schools now than there were 3 years ago. They are falling apart is too strong a word, but they are weakening. The reform movement hasn't built a new day school in God knows how many years. There's one sector of the non-Orthodox world, the community, RavSec I think it's called, that is growing. But if you take the total number of non-Orthodox day schools, it represents about, and the number of kids who go to non-Orthodox day schools, it represents about 3%. 3% of the non-Orthodox cohort in America goes to day schools. That means 97% does not go. 97% is stuck going to these awful
Hebrews.
And it's not 97%. It's meaningfully less because larger and larger minority get no Jewish education. So that's the truth of it. So the fact that virtually all Orthodox kids go to day schools is something that I take no credit for. They have a different set of values. You remember that earlier distinction. So if 3% of the non-Orthodox world goes to day schools, what can one say about the success of day schools?
Should the Jewish community give communal funding to Orthodox day schools?
Proportionate to their number? Fine, sure. Proportionate to the Orthodox number in the Jewish community? Fine. I have no problem with that.
Okay. When we were together last in Jerusalem, you were speaking at an event celebrating Birthright Israel. And we heard first from Michael Oren, who is the ambassador to Washington, to the United States for the State of Israel. And Michael got up and said the following. You heard him. When I was a young person, I knew nothing Jewishly. In fact, at my bar mitzvah, I read transliterated Hebrew. But over the course of my life, things had an impact on me. One, I was aware of the Holocaust, which was very important to me. Number two, I experienced, he said, personal anti-Semitism growing up in New Jersey.
I remember.
Third, the Six-Day War had a tremendous impact on my father. If you remember, Michael describes how his father brought the Life magazine picture to the kitchen table with the Israeli soldier holding up the Egyptian gun, and the father kisses the picture and says, "I love this boy."
Yes,
and Michael says, "I wanted to be that boy." And then the fourth thing that moved him tremendously was the move to save Soviet Jewry. And those are the things that changed him. And I said to myself, how interesting. It wasn't Hebrew school. It wasn't Talmud Torah. It was 4 experiences that somehow touched him. You spoke later at the same session, and you spoke about your concern, your worry about the Jewish future, and what you said was, there has to be a greater commitment to Jewish education. You are, it's almost a mantra now for you of how you believe Jewish education is critical. I want you to reflect for me upon your decision with Charles Bronfman to fund Birthright Israel, because as far as I can tell, Michael, and you can tell me if you think I'm wrong, the only place today the young Jew growing up has a chance for an emotional experience in any way akin to what moved a Michael Oren. The Holocaust is almost ancient history now. There's very little anti-Semitism. You described that already. The movement to save Soviet Jewry is also ancient history, and basically, as Sharansky told us at the GA, there's no more communities left to save. And you know, where at the moment there is no Six-Day War, that miracle, if emotional events, if experiences are what really create the soul you're trying to help create, Birthright Israel did that. It takes people, young Jews, and drops them into Israel for a 10-day period, and somehow it changes them, although we haven't had a chance for you to discuss here the extent to which you're pleased or not pleased with the end game for Birthright Israel after kids come back. But what I'm worried about, Michael, and this is the last thing I wanted you to speak about, is I don't know where our younger generation is going to find the experiences that are equivalent to, and I don't want anti-Semitism, I don't want another Holocaust, but where are the emotional experiences going to come from other than Birthright Israel that are going to touch the Jewish soul? And my last point to you is, a bar mitzvah is too young to really understand Judaism as you and I are discussing it. It's unfair to ask a 13-year-old to think about Judaism from an adult perspective. The Jewish home is for kids. Judaism, Torah, is for adults, not 13-year-olds. Birthright Israel is for high school kids and college kids. And in high school and college, you have a chance to begin to touch the emotional part of what being a Jew is. So I don't know if you've ever thought of it in these terms, and you'll give me the best answer you can, Al Regel Achad, on 1 foot here. But what is the equivalent to all the things we heard Michael Oren talk about that will, in your mind, motivate, inspire, in some way create an inspiration in this younger generation of Jews whom you so aptly describe as being lost to the Jewish future?
First of all, Mark, I would say that is a great question, phrased differently than I've heard it in the past, and it's the right question.
Thank you.
The right question. My best answer to it is as follows. At the moment, assuming, as we'd all like to assume, that life in the future will be tranquil and sweet and pleasant, without violence, without fear, without turmoil, without poverty, without the things that create upheaval and anti-Semitism and war and stuff like that. Assuming that climate, which is good for Jews and maybe not so good for Judaism, that sort of thing, we're stuck with the following. We have to develop Jewish education that resonates. those 9 values that I referred to are intended, and I only created them to try to have, to give an opportunity to younger kids to really understand. I mean, I think a 13-year-old can understand what struggling spirituality is. I think a 13-year-old, for instance, one of the other values, and what I'm going to try to do, and what the religion has really failed to do, is to try to link to these kids the extraordinary achievements of the Jewish people in the last 300 years. So one of the Jewish values that I talk about, which I didn't mention before, was creativity. Wow. What is it in the Jewish soul that has allowed us to achieve, in a creative sense, so much out of proportion to our number? The writers, the scientists, the musicians, the artists, and to try to put that as part of Jewish education. Forget all the biblical myths and the nonsense and crossing the Red Sea and that Jibberwocky, forgive me, and ask them, why do we have so many great people in the last 200 or 300 years? What is it? Is it our heredity, our social Darwinism? Is it a gift from God? What magic is there? And try to force that sort of focus upon Jewish kids to make them into Jews. When I go to Birthright and I go on these, I go visit the kids in the mega events and on their trips, it's deeply disappointing to me that these kids are the product of Hebrew school education. They are, I say this out loud and I shouldn't say it, they're Jewish barbarians, and something's got to change them, and 10 days of Birthright isn't enough. And I work enormously hard toward creating what we call, it was now called Birthright Next. So we have now tens and tens and tens of thousands of them going to Shabbat dinners, peer-led Shabbat dinners. Hopefully that will be a major addition. Most of them have never gone to a Shabbat dinner. And we're about to have a new program run by Aaron Lansky of the Yiddish Book Center to educate them. I mean, it's small stuff. Can't get the resources to do it. But that's another thing we're trying to do. But the overwhelming things are, number one, to dramatically improve the education, talking about things like creativity and struggling spirituality and stuff like that, so to bring them along as Jews. Birthright, more of a relationship with Israel, having been going back and forth, because Israel's a maturing experience in many ways. Post-Birthright experiences, going back, second trips to Israel, I think will be helpful as well. And I'm out of alternatives. I don't have that much, because you want to have experiences that will impact them in a meaningful way, and sitting in a classroom can only be so much. So those are the things that come to mind. Other people talk about camp. I'm not as optimistic as others are about Jewish camp, but I think it is probably a good thing. But if I had to say one thing that we should emphasize to the degree we can, it's Israel, because Israel seems to work. They grow up there, they feel more Jewish there, and we've got to do that more. And I'm sorry I couldn't give you a better answer.
That's very nice. I love you very much. You know, you have a very interesting reputation as a bear, but you've always been so kind and gentle with me and willing to share ideas, and I am very, very grateful. I began by reading a page from your book. I'm going to read a very short close. This was the last words of your address on the last day of the first Birthright. And again, it says so much about Michael Steinhardt. Here's what you told these young people. We here must firmly resolve that all those who lived and died for Jewry shall not have lived and died in vain. We must promise that this people, in partnership with the living and the dead, with God and humanity, shall have a new birth of freedom. We must live our lives as witnesses, as teachers, as builders, so that the Torah of the Jewish people, the teaching by the Jewish people, the concern for the Jewish people, shall flourish again on this earth. Michael, this is what you've done. This This is what you've devoted the last 15 years of your life to. No one has done it with more passion and more heart. And I thank you. But I'm only going to put a semicolon. I'm going to come back. We'll continue this discussion. But I thank you so much for letting me come here and sort of pick your brains and your willingness to share so much of yourself with our viewing community. I wish you'd kol tuva hatzlacha, only the best for you.
Thank you, Mark.
Health and long life for you. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
And that was our meeting with Michael Steinhardt. By the way, if you want to be in touch with Michael, you can do so through me. Simply email me or write me, and I'll pass your emails on to Michael. And as you heard, if you would like a copy of his speech, you can do so by emailing me, and we will send it to you as soon as you are in touch with us. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.